we'll go ahead and get started. This is intended really to be much more of a Q&A, sort of interactive session than purely an information giving session. So hopefully at this point, uh, you've started thinking about your applications and that it's not completely on your back burner. Although I know you're busy with AIs and other clinical rotations at the start of your fourth year. So if there's any questions you have regarding process, regarding even the nuts and bolts of your letters of recommendation, your personal statement, this is really an opportunity for you to ask. And then we'll also make sure that we cover a few questions that I suspect are out there and you may not recognize them yet, such as the supplemental application and the like. So with that, we'll just turn it over and make it an open floor at the moment to anyone who has a question they want to start with.
Sure. I have a question as somebody who is still deciding whether to apply directly to internal medicine or to apply to a different specialty that requires a preliminary year in internal medicine. I was just wondering how the application process might, or if you could elaborate more on how the application process would be different for somebody who's applying for preliminary internal medicine, in terms of, I guess, like how does it work for like is it like how does the application process work? How does the chair letter work in that case?
Sure.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
elaborate more
So
on that.
really, they're going to be the overall process is going to be essentially the same, so long as it's a specialty that's participating in the match through ERIS. I don't know if any of the smaller subspecialties that do early matches go outside of ERIS, but so long as they're in ERIS, it would all be the same exact process. Let's say you were applying to a place that like a anesthesiology or radiology or neurology, and part of the requirement of that program, let's say they don't have a built-in sort of internship year built into their own program. So you're applying as a separate prelim transition year to go into an advanced match position under that circumstance. So if that's the case, then you would be applying to internal medicine as a preliminary. And so you would select that in what type of program you're looking for. And then your program, your chair letter from us would essentially be the same, regardless of you were doing categorical or a prelim year. So we would still write our letter of recommendation that would go to the presumably an internal medicine preliminary position. It would not necessarily be required if you were applying to a surgical transitional year or a family medicine transitional year. But if it's an internal medicine preliminary program to which you're applying, then we would write the same program director, chair's letter. You would certainly let us know that that was your intent, if that's the case. Not that we would write our letter any differently per se, but it would definitely alert me not to make specific reference that you'd be also potentially applying to two different programs. If say you were doing a categorical year, the only difference might be I would make sure I didn't have in there somehow any inference that you were only applying to one. I wouldn't mention it at all, which I haven't in any of the letters I've written thus far. I just simply say that that would be a great applicant, or within our parameters of wording, who would meet these kinds of criteria, and it would be the same. So the only difference I would say that I would foresee is is that the chair's letter is going to do nothing for your application necessarily to ENT or urology. if that was the case. You would, or whoever else you were applying to. So you would not, when you were divvying out the chair's letter, you would have it so that you would send it to your preliminary program. You would not send it to your anesthesia, ENT, or other program of that nature. There'd be no need to. If you were applying to both, let's say you were doing preliminary and anesthesia, and then simultaneously, because you weren't decided yet, applying to categorical internal medicine, then you would be essentially applying to three different programs, so to speak. And then when you did your categorical, you would just send the same chair's letter, but your letter of recommendations that you would be sending would be different. And there's nothing that prohibits you from applying to all three programs if that's what you're doing, or if you're simultaneously applying to say urology because it's early match internal medicine, apply to internal medicine the way you normally would. Send your letters of recommendation that you think are appropriate. You don't have to reference urology at all within your application. As far as they're concerned, you're applying to internal medicine. You would just withdraw if you matched early and were pulling out. Or if they were concurrent, you just apply to two programs concurrently. You don't have to mention at all what you're doing in that regard. And then when you're ranking them, you would simply rank which program type, i.e., urology, let's say, or radiation oncology, because they're at the same exact time. So radiation oncology, you'd rank those programs right on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then if internal medicine was your second choice of specialty, so to speak, then you would number 11 might be then a internal medicine program through 20. And it would, if you matched in radiation oncology, then it would give you one of your first 10 before it even got down to your internal medicine. So that, I don't know if I answered your question, but the application process is going to be the same. Your ranking is going to be different if you're applying to two different programs and ranking two different programs simultaneously. And the only difference I would see is you would not send our letter to the surgical programs, the non-medicine programs, and that same letter would serve you whether it was categorical or preliminary.
Yeah, that answered my question. And then I guess I was thinking of a follow-up too, if I do decide, say, to apply for a preliminary internal medicine position instead. Things like having an acting internship in internal medicine ahead of applying, is that become as important as it would for somebody who's applying categorical? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it may not be quite as critical, but it's going to be important either way. And I wouldn't say it's important to necessarily, if you haven't got assigned a date before you apply, um, I wouldn't overly stress on that one. You can't control everything. It's not like they're not going to potentially interview on that aspect. It would just be pending, so to speak, on the application part. The applications are going to go out months before the actual interview, so you could. I'll look into the logistics of this. I think you can update certain things, and then we could, you could update the information in your ARIS application subsequently or whatnot.
Got it. Thank you.
Can you similarly send the same chairs letter to categorical and a combined IM program like med psych? So the answer, yes. If the med psych program wanted a chairs letter for that because of the medicine component, yeah, you could use the same chairs letter for both programs. The chairs letter that we will send is a fairly uniform formatted letter. It's very similar in many regards to the MSPE you get from the dean's office. It's just more internal medicine specific with sort of the extensive comments and analysis from the internal medicine perspective of so all your comments from your medicine rotations will be in there, and the perspective obviously of the person writing it will be on the same page in terms of other internal medicine programs, in terms of conveying where you are in sort of the milestone sort of professional development spectrum. And even though it's not exactly the rhyme format, it's some of the information is similarly structured regarding where you are in terms of your reporting skills and managing skills and the like. It's kind of an all-encompassing assessment of which of these skills you've mastered and which ones you're working on from that perspective, as evident from your evaluations. And to the point of our previous questioner, uh, um, if you had not done your AI, the comment will simply say, this is where things stood at the end of the third year. Uh, we have, not yet assessed in the fourth year. So if you're a subspecialist and not doing an AI in internal medicine, then the internal medicine port would just simply be left at your M3 assessments and say something polite, unable to assess beyond any progression during the fourth year based on our current evaluations. So while you all are thinking through your own questions, the supplemental application for internal medicine is worth noting. I don't know beyond internal medicine how other programs are utilizing that, if they even have it. But um, based on sort of feedback at the most recent AIM meeting, which stands for the Alliance of Academic Internal Medicine, which are program directors, core clerkship directors, coordinators, and fellowship directors and the like. There was a conversation during that time regarding the supplemental application, and not every program has universally, I guess, participated or used the supplements, but amongst the programs that have, I would say there's still not 100% um, understanding, even within the individual program levels, of how to utilize some aspects of that information, particularly the supplemental essay. However, there was broad agreement that two things they are universally liked and do carry some weight when provided. It's not that anyone suggested that it worked against someone who was not submitting a supplemental application, but it was definitely something that was helpful and used when they were presented with the information. And those were the region designations and the pinning of programs, sort of selecting sort of your sort of targets. No one looked at it as a negative if they hadn't been selected necessarily. It was more that the regional one particularly was very helpful. Nowadays, with most things done by virtual interviewing, people are applying perhaps more broadly than they might have in the past because the expense has been eliminated. And so it's easier to access places at a less cost. And so, yes, students are applying perhaps to programs they may not have in the past. And so, where the regional designations have been helpful is regardless of whether you're tr- training in the region or not, it gives them a heads up as to whether when they're screening, you would be someone who might seriously consider moving outside of wherever you are. So if you are in California and you're applying to a Midwestern state, they may look in and say, well, why is this person this person's not likely going to move to Chicago. And so if you've designated that you're specifically looking at that region as one of your priorities, then those that are using screening tools that include region and other game theory type processes might say, oh, they're actually more serious, and then they alerts them if they were otherwise disinclined to look at the application because of reasons of geography, then give you a specific look. The pinning of the individual programs is again similar, particularly if you're outside of something that they would consider their usual area of catchment, that you're seriously looking at their program specifically. So It wasn't to say that it's going to get you an interview at a program to which um, you may not meet their screening criteria from a standards standpoint. If they're looking for a specific type of applicant and that you are not, let's say it's a research-based program and you have no research background whatsoever, and that's a strong part of what they consider, then no, it's not going to be able to overcome that sort of barrier. But if you're meeting their criteria and you're not the typical candidate, perhaps because of the school, the location, or whatnot, that they normally have a high likelihood of getting, and so they're more inclined to interviewing people from the state of Illinois and Chicago because they're most likely to come. But if you've pinned them, then they'll notice that. And again, if you're outside of their typical person that might have been screened out up front, they might give you a second look at that point on the screening side to say, oh, this person's actually indicating they want to come here. Let's take a closer look and just see, do they meet our criteria? And even though they're from Virginia and Virginia people don't typically come here, for this person's application, let's give it a look. So it does alert them, and it may get your attention there. It does not necessarily translate once you've interviewed in any particular huge um, impact there either, in the sense that if I'm going to use just hypotheticals, let's say they use a scoring system that's 1 to 5 and you have a 3, it's not going to vault you ahead of a 5 on their scale. However, within the group of 3, which may be the majority of their applicants, let's say, then it may sort of force them, in a sense, to look at, oh, all these people are, relatively speaking, equal in our opinion, and this is going to take us from, person number 30 on our list to number 100 on our list. And that's likely where the cutoff is going to fall in terms of where we'll max out in terms of our filling the spots. So if you're in that circumstance where you're in that broad group in the middle that usually will encompass a good chunk, if you've indicated that you want to go to them, it may well give you that little sort of leg up to say, within this broad group, hey, if we have no reason to choose one over the other, this person's interested in our program, we'd rather have someone who is enthusiastic about wanting to come to our program than someone who may be indifferent to it. Okay. So within the tier, yes, it may give you a leg up in that regard, which may be all the difference in the world in terms of matching or not matching. Okay. So you can use that information as you will. It's not telling you what you have to do, but just realize they do look at those two things specifically when they're engaged in the supplemental. The essay, since it's an optional essay, I couldn't get a good sense that anyone was overly enthusiastic about it compared to the personal statement itself. But I will leave it at that. If you have any additional questions, then certainly fire away and I'll answer them as best I can.
When you say pref a region, does that mean like a state or just like southeast, northeast?
Yeah, I think that the question as they pose it to you all are specific regions. They're not specific states. Now you can certainly indicate all of this information too in your personal statement, because you can send specific personal statements to individual programs. So, or to groups of programs. So you could have one, if you were targeting the state of California and you've put the Pacific, the Pacific or the West Coast, which might include, let's say, Washington, Seattle, but you're really targeting Southern California. There is nothing that prohibits you, because there may be a lot of programs there and you may not have been able to designate them all, and you may not have chosen to want to designate amongst them. So, but you could definitely say in your letter and have one that goes to Southern California specifically, to all the programs down there, that, this is a priority because my family lives in Orange County and I'm wanting to be close to my family. That's the type of stuff you can put, and that's obviously not going to fly very well if you're simultaneously applying to a program up in Chicago, to simply say my priority is to get to Southern California. So you may just eliminate that line and leave everything else the same if you want. Or if your primary target is California, but you're also including the Midwest because your fiance's family is in Chicago, then you could, even if you didn't designate the whole region, you could simply put on there, hey, I have this interest in Chicago too. My family is in the West Coast, if you wanted to add that or not, but you can certainly indicate to the people in Chicago, hey, I've got reasons to be interested in your area as well. So it's very regional oriented. It's not city state oriented on that pinning. And I think someone just posted on there about the regions on the chat. All right, so have you all started writing your essays yet? Your personal statements? I will take that as a no, but I doubt that's the case. One word of advice again about personal statements. Try, after you've written your rough draft, to make sure it's applicable and specific to you. And by that, I mean, if you were to read that letter, that essay or personal statement, and you could interject your friend's name on them, and it would flow just as easily and be able to describe someone else that you know, then your personal statement may not be personal enough. So you want it to say something about you specifically. This is your opportunity to give a sense of who you are, what you're about, and you don't want it to be so generic that it could describe 50% of your peers just as well. So, and it's not just the words you're using; it's sort of the style and the tenor of the voice that you're conveying as well. So you want it to be reflective of who you are, both your style, your personality, and your interests. And so you should be able to see you uniquely in that statement. And if you can't, then say, go back to the drawing board a little bit and say what's not coming through on there that I want to convey about myself. And if it's your enthusiasm for X, Y, or Z, then make sure that enthusiasm somehow is conveyed not just blandly, but with words and sentiments that will show, again, enthusiasm or excitement about it, sort of thing. So whatever it is you're writing, just make sure it's you. If you're a quiet type of person, it's okay to let that reflect as well, particularly if it's a quiet, thoughtful, processing type person and you're going into a processing type of specialty, that may be appreciated. If you're a quiet person in one that requires a lot of interactions and communications, then you're going to want to make sure that aspect of you comes through too. If what makes you well in teams, if that's going to be an important aspect of your subspecialty. And most things on your CV are going to look like you've done individual sports, individual activities, not necessarily team-based things. Then you may want to somehow convey messages and thoughts about times you've worked within large groups and what you enjoyed and were effective in, and how that motivated you to do, go into the field you're going into. Something that's going to come out and again explain a part of you what's different, but yet how you also can bring your differences to a specialty that may be pushing beyond what they typically see in your application. So, well, there's only two pictures on here, Ray and Krishna. So Krishna, since I work with your indirect family, anything you want to add to the conversation to get the party started, so to speak?
No, you've answered most of the questions I had. The supplemental app was kind of my big question, and just how to approach that. I guess just looking forward for the rest of the year. From a scheduling standpoint, we'll be meeting with you or someone else in August to kind of go over the list, and for you to just let us know if it seems feasible, reasonable based on our current kind of how our app looks.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yes, your advisors that you've been assigned. I am actually taking over Dr. Ashley's advisee. So if you are an Dr. Ashley advisee, then you're now with me. But yeah, we'll look over your list and we can certainly advise you regarding the mix of programs that you've gotten. So yeah, you'll want to do that. Obviously in advance of the applications being viewable by the programs, because you're going to want to make sure that you've got a reasonable mix as much as possible, honestly, on day one. Because as we talked about in the last meeting, programs are going to do a large dump right there at the very beginning, and you want to make sure you get your application completed. So when they're doing their reviews, whether it's that day, more likely in the weeks ahead, that when they get to your area of the alphabet or however they're doing it, you want to make sure that they first pull up that application. They've got as much information about you as possible, and your letters and everything in there. So, but yes, we will go over it and certainly advise you if you need to broaden your scope or expand a different area. And then equally importantly, keep that individual appraised of how your interviewing, your interview invites, I should say, are going, because that is going to be your first indication of how you were matched up in terms of your assessment of yourself and the programs you're looking for and their assessment of you. So don't panic by any means, but as you see things coming through, if you are looking at the programs, it will give you a sense of geography and types of programs that are positively indicating their thoughts about your application, and equally the definitive no's are also giving you some degree of feedback if you're seeing trends in terms of which types of programs are inviting you and not inviting you. It's going to give you valuable insight in terms of where you're fitting in to the applications in terms of relative to your peers from other places, and then use that information, particularly if you have choices, to help then guide you in terms of your interviews as well as your ranking, right? Because if let's say whatever the gold tier schools are in your mind that you've applied to, and the gold tier maybe simply be the ones you were prioritizing and wanting to go to. But if you're not seeing that you're getting applications in that group, then but you could say one invite in there, then that's great to be excited about going to that one and interviewing with the one. But when you're ranking it, you're certainly not going to just put down one on your list, because then you're putting all your eggs in a basket in a pool that was potentially already giving you some indication that may suggest that you're probably not the strongest person within, if assuming all the schools in that tier are equally critical in terms of what they're looking for, then if you got 1 out of 10 interviews there, then it's going to say, hey, I got an interview, that's great, I've got a chance, but I may not be the strongest candidate for that program, and therefore I'm going to want to balance that against others that are probably maybe not my preference in terms of program, but these are where I'm getting a lot of interviews. So now I got to be even more critical here, because these people are telling me there's a good chance. So if I put one ahead of the other, then this is where the placement may make more of a difference, and then I can go reach for this other program, which I think is a little bit of a stretch for me, but I got to be really more critical when I get to this group here. So that's how I use that information. So your advisor can, if you keep them up to date about how your interviews are going, particularly after you've gotten several, let them know both where you got accepted and where you didn't, and which ones are still on your waiting list, like you haven't heard from, so that they can look at that list and also advise you were the estimates of the mix on target at the beginning or not. Yeah, in terms of the question is mixed. They've heard mixed things about adding a subspecialty preference. So if you're applying to internal medicine, saying you're interested in GI or geriatrics and all, I would tell you that not many programs are going to put a huge amount of weight where they're holding it against you one way or the other. It certainly doesn't necessarily hurt or help you, in my opinion. It largely, I think, can be used more if it's going to be a great way of showing something that you're enthusiastic about. What the applicant screener and the people reviewing your application are going to simply want to see is that you're enthusiastic about something or learn something about you. And if it's geriatrics and you in your essay are communicating, because that the specific question is about mentioning it in your interests and personal statement and interview process. If it's a way of conveying something that you're enthusiastic about, they don't care if it's geriatrics, cardiology, or GI. They're going to see someone who is enthusiastic and passionate about something. Okay. So they won't say, oh, this one's geriatrics, this one's cardiology, we want cardiology. No, they're not going to use that. It's not going to help you or hurt you in that regard. But they may see someone who wants to use internal medicine and needs to do internal medicine because they're pursuing their passions, in which case they're passionate about internal medicine to get to where they want to be. So use it not as a defining characteristic that's going to make or break you, but as this is what I like. And this is me. Right? Did that answer your question? Okay.
Dr. Barrett, this is kind of a random question, and I was just wondering if you had any insight. So obviously, from a letter standpoint, we can do, I guess, a total of 4. Have you heard anything, or just do you have your own thoughts on if it's absolutely required to get a letter from your acting internship versus just using strong letters from 3rd year?
Yeah. So obviously it can't be required if your AI is not required to have been completed prior. So it's not a requirement by any means. And you can actually have more than 4 letters. You're generally speaking going to have your chair's letter plus 3 additional from most programs. They'll tell you specifically if they want something different than that. But those are, you're going to submit 3 to the program. You could have technically as many letter writers as you want. You would just have to be tracking which ones you were intending to send to specific programs. And you would ask, why would I ever do that? It may be that there's a specific letter writer that you may not think of globally, but has maybe specific connections to one of your programs that you think would be helpful, and they were going to write you a good letter that you think would be very targeted to someone who's going to be reviewed on the other side. So you can target the letter based on that sort of an application. If you have a strong research interest, you could certainly have a researcher that's writing your letters and submit it to these programs where you're thinking, oh, this might not help me as much at these other programs, and therefore send 3 clinical-based letters that might target this other group of programs. So you can have more than the 4, but nevertheless, your question is the mix of the letter writers. No, it does not have to be an AI. It should be able should definitely have at least two of those letters, I would say, speak to your clinical skills. So you're going to want to have someone who's worked with you in the clinical setting, who can speak to your strengths and do it in a personal way that indicates they really do know how you were functioning. So the research person who's not worked with you in a clinical setting is only going to help you from a research perspective. They're going to do nothing for your application in terms of the clinical. This is the person they are. That one person who's way off and maybe you did some special project with, again, is going to speak a lot to your characteristics and maybe an important part of your application, but they're not going to be able to speak to the clinical skills. So you're going to want to have at a minimum one person who's going to definitely be able to speak. Two would be ideal for internal medicine. People who can speak to your clinical abilities, but you can weigh that against what the other person you think is going to add that this one not. The one that I would tell you never works to your advantage is writing letters for hierarchy, or choosing letters for hierarchy. Having the chairman of HEMONC write your letter because to a fellowship program in HEMONC, or Dr. Syme writing, because she's the chair of internal medicine, writing a specific letter of recommendation on your behalf does not help you in the least unless you specifically worked with Dr. Syme in the clinical setting on pulmonary consults, and then only if she can speak to your ability. The rank itself does not fly if they can't say something substantive about you. Otherwise, they'll just say, oh, it's some ambitious person who asked the highest persons they knew, thinking that rank was going to do it for them. And we've all seen those letters and we toss them because the letters invariably say, I met with this person, and it's like they read the CV, you read the CV, and you're like, this adds nothing. They are just kind of using rank as a tool to their end. So it turns some of us off when we see that. So always have it someone you've worked with, someone who knows you, can speak to you. Research, clinical, doesn't matter what, make sure they at least know who you are and can speak to your skills, your personality, your abilities.
I have
Doesn't,
a question kind of piggybacking off of that, if you don't mind.
yeah.
How would it look if you got a letter from your senior on when you were on IM for third year, but now they're going to be attending in like 2 months or so? Because they're graduating from residency. I don't know, because you kind of spoke to the rank not really mattering. Because I've worked with this person for like 3.5 weeks during IM wards, and I think they would be able to talk about my skill level very well.
Yeah, no, that would work. So the letter writer is a faculty member at the time. Their experience with you like a few months earlier when you were a third year and they were a fourth year intern or something like resident, or a third year resident. No, that's perfectly okay. They would sign it on their faculty letterhead. They would say, this is a setting I worked with them in. Even if they said I worked with them as a student, as a resident, that's not gonna hinder it at all, so long as they are specifically speaking to your abilities and they know how to write a letter. So if there's any questions, they could always ask another faculty member, how to write the letter of recommendation. But because there are some skills in writing the letter of recommendation. But no, if they can speak to you, that is better than having someone who doesn't know you by far. And yes, it can be on HEMONC or any cardiology service. Where within internal medicine the source is doesn't matter. It does not have to be a generalist. It doesn't have to be a hospitalist. It can be a pulmonary. It can be HEMONC. It could be geriatrics. It could be primary care, outpatient medicine. The issue isn't what specialty and what the setting was. It's just that they've worked with you in some capacity and can speak to you at a personal level. It doesn't, you just want them to know you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And again, to the HEMONC question, it doesn't matter if you're not planning on going to HEMONC. Right now, you're planning to internal medicine. So the HEMONC person is still considered an internal medicine doctor from the standpoint of training and background and frame of reference. So you do not have to go into HEMONC, be going into HEMONC to have a HEMONC person write your letter. Well, I'll tell you, I'm always available. I am slow, sometimes to get back to people. So if you don't get a response to me generally within 24 hours, just nudge it again. And it can be by email. I am putting. Uh, so that is a cell phone number for me. And I do not object to people texting me and say, "Hey, I sent you an email. Do you mind taking a look at it?" Or do you mind if I calling when you have a chance, or can we set up a time to call? Uh, I tend not to look at things during the middle of the day when I'm in clinic if I'm seeing patients, but I'll look at those. And if you put on their medical student, Lindsay, medical student, applying to internal medicine, I'll at least know this isn't some random robo person, and I'll say, yeah, available this evening or tomorrow morning early. Does off hours work for you? That kind of stuff. So feel free to put that in your contacts and just text me if I'm not responding to the email within the first 24, 48 hours. I will be on vacation for the entire month of August. So be mindful of that. I'll be gone for 4 weeks. Okay. Well, I tell you what, if any question comes up, you let me know. And certainly reach out to your advisors. All of the people who are advising are experienced within the education side of internal medicine. So everyone that you are assigned to is capable. They're all APDs, clerkship directors, and the like. So we all are familiar with the application process. We're all familiar with the frame of reference and mindset of the people who are screening your applications. So feel free to reach out to them first and foremost, but you can certainly use me as a resource as well. So if there's no other questions, have a great night.
Thanks, Dr. Barrett.
Okay.
Appreciate it.